Hello and welcome to the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Matthew Trenhaile. Matthew, thank you very much for joining me. Before we get into this episode, make sure you follow us on Twitter @BettingPod and check out the website businessofbetting.com. Guest suggestions are much appreciated. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair Proprietary Limited. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Matthew Trenhaile. Matthew, thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Jake. Looking forward to this very much.
So Matthew, for those who aren't aware, what's your background in the industry and how did you get started with betting and wagering?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Jake. This is one of the questions I feared most of all the questions you could ask me because you have these illustrious guests who have the most phenomenal early childhood almost betting stories. You know, I'm waiting, particularly with the Aussie guests. I'm still waiting for someone to say that their first bet was, you know, an exacta from the womb in the Sydney Carnival or something like that. But
not far away.
I was very late to betting. In fact, I had virtually no interest in betting at all at school. I wasn't the school bookmaker. I had probably placed, you know, limited accumulator type betting shop bets on football, but yeah, no real interest in betting at all until I actually ended up working in the industry. But one thing, so I was trying to think to myself, I know he's going to probably ask me this, and I had to think of some way to tie into why betting is so interesting to me. You know, betting has become an obsession for me working in the industry. I love studying it, love hearing other people talk about it, love talking about it myself. And the one thing that I picked out that was very close, and you have to bear with me on this, to sort of the betting world, was that I was a huge fan as a child of a game called Top Trumps. I don't know how well this translates to international listeners, but Top Trumps was a pretty boring game whereby you'd have, I think it was 30 cards, and on those cards was maybe types of car or plane or tank, and they'd have statistics for each sort of factor. So in cars, it would be the top speed or 0 to 60, cubic size of engine, these kind of things. And each person, you'd split the cards between you and someone else. You'd each take a card from the top of your pile. You'd choose a stat. And in the original incarnation of the game, you would choose a stat that you would say would be the highest. You compare it with your opponent's card. If you won, you got both the cards. The game went on. It really was, in many ways, as boring as it sounds. But the appeal was the cards. So for my favorite ever Top Trumps pack was exotic sports cars. This would be early 90s. And I think it was things like, you know, the Ferrari Testarossa and maybe early Lamborghini Diablo, that kind of thing. And they're all the kind of cars that at that age I desperately wanted to own myself. And I would just loved the stats part of it, rather tragically. Very hard to get any other kids to play these games for any real length of time. But I loved not only the stats, but I wanted to be tragically good at this. So I would write down the stats, you know, pre sort of Excel kind of thing. I would write down the stats for every card, every category, and I'd rank them so I knew who was number one for width of car. And you knew that all the kids always wanted to compare top speeds, these kind of things. So if you went with height of car, which was really obscure, really. And so I realized that to be honest, I love putting things in order and ranking them, basically. And I then got so into this, you can do a variant whereby you can choose to have the lowest stat. So you can choose, when you call out the card, instead of going for the highest, I want to go lowest. And then it got even worse because then I found maybe one or two people who would play this extensively with me. And we created a what we thought of as a poker variant. We sort of started to get into a little bit into. Again, I never played poker, but I liked watching it on late night Channel 4 in the UK. They did poker, and the thing that I found most fascinating about that is they had the under the table camera through the glass, and I absolutely loved that. But we went with a poker variant whereby you would deal out 5 top trumps, and you then had to pick a category, and you'd add up the stats for all 5 cards. So you'd have to know how good overall the total was. You can see where this goes. So in the end, like when you're a kid, you add layers and layers of rules to these games. And ultimately, I thought to myself, looking back, there is so much of what's appealing in doing that game that way that basically led me to really, at the moment I walked into somewhere like IG Index, which was the sports spread betting company where I got my very first betting job. And the idea of taking numbers and ranking teams, players, you name it, and thinking through that process was just immediately appealing to me. And I graduated at some point from playing top trumps with my own silly rules to playing a bit of Magic the Gathering, which I'm glad to say gets a little bit of a look in now with betting conversations. I know that Ted Knutson, who's a big player in the football statistics industry, he talks about how Pinnacle employed a lot of Magic the Gathering players. He was very into the game himself, an excellent writer on the subject of the game as well. So again, I had the interest in stats, and I got into games and the theory behind games. And that undoubtedly made it so that when I very first got a betting job, I instantly could see elements in betting that had appealed from that. So I have no fabulous first betting story, I'm afraid. I have no family who've got any interest in betting. And I've never worked in a betting shop even, or on the rails, on course, anything like that. All I have is a rather tragic story about how I invented a way to play top trumps in a slightly more interesting way.
No, it's not terribly unusual. Obviously, you mentioned some of the stories of betting out of the womb, but I think also Magic the Gathering's come up a few times. You mentioned Ted before, and Marco at Pinnacle mentioned he was interested in that when he started out. Backgammon and chess and some of these multi-layered games, even blackjack, albeit a more of a closed system rather than sports betting and some of these other options which are almost unlimited and multi-layered and multi-factored. But it's an interesting sort of different perspective, but it also ties in with what you can find with a lot of these people that have, I guess, developed over years and years, albeit maybe not knowing this type of thinking and this type of approach, not just thinking 1 or 2 steps ahead, but perhaps even more.
Absolutely. For me, the recent sort of discussions I've seen about Magic the Gathering, and I asked myself why, Ted says that they had the perfect skill set for doing, not just bookmaking, but sort of the sharper end of bookmaking. And I found myself thinking, do you know what? I often thought a lot of the people who played Magic were quite bright. They often fell into sort of the more studious, more academic category, those who were interested in it. And I thought, well, maybe it's just that. But the more and more I thought about Magic, and it's hard to explain without people who know at least a bit about the game, but it's a game where you build your own deck. You bring your own deck to the game, which you've designed and built to beat the other players. And at the top level, it's an incredible exercise, not only in playing what is a very complex game with a lot of rules, but it is a great example of game theory in many ways, in that you're not just playing your deck, you're playing what they would call the meta, which is what other decks are going to be popular at that tournament, and certain decks in a sort of rock, paper, scissors style would be better against other decks. And then I started thinking about that game, and I thought about, for example, betting models. Someone brings the expected goals model to the table if this was a game, while another guy brings his ELO model to the table. They have strengths, they have weaknesses, and I can see how if you just took these guys and said, right, the game is no longer Magic the Gathering. The game is the world betting marketplace, and we've got to make money by creating odds that compare favorably for us to the marketplace. I definitely could see how, and one thing also I ought to add is that Magic the Gathering players love nothing more than breaking things. And when I say that, they love to find cards and card combinations in the game that just completely destroy everyone. To the extent that Magic has got a long list of in professional play or high level play of having cards that are banned or restricted to only one copy in your deck, because normally you're allowed 4 copies of a card in your deck. And the reason they do this is because these people are exceptional at breaking the game over and over again, even though these games are play tested by exceptional people at Wizards of the Coast, the company that sort of produces it. And so you've got these people who are just brilliant at understanding the game to the point whereby they can pick loopholes in. And I think that is something that applies to most of the best professional gamblers, is incredible curiosity, incredible desire to solve a problem, and completely overpower the problem. And I think that, and so I started thinking about that, and I thought, and then the other thing is it's got variance built into it, Magic. There's a shuffled deck involved. You can play exceptionally and still lose just due to poor variance. And then you add that to poker, because Magic's not conventionally played actually for money. There's tournaments and there's a big professional scene in it where there's quite high stakes prizes. But then you add in people who play Magic and poker, and the poker people will really understand. I always think this is that sports betting people who have a poker background, they may be better or worse than the average at betting on sports, but they definitely tend to understand variance slightly keener to me, because until you've played 10,000 hands, of Hold'em or whatever it may be, it's hard to sort of understand how. I love these pages you'll get where they show Monte Carlo simulations of like people playing blackjack or poker heads up, and you can just you can have an edge and do the right thing time and time again, but still there's strands of that simulation which show you losing money hand over fist for huge periods of time. So poker players understand, they don't get disheartened, so they turn up in Curacao, you've got a brilliant knowledge of poker, brilliant problem, Magic the Gathering of problem solving. You're used to dealing in large amounts of money, so you're not put off by that. You're used to variance, and you're desperate to basically prove that you're smarter than the other guy. And when I put all that together, I thought, yep, I reckon Ted's got it pretty bang right. That does seem just about the best person to employ if I was going to set up a shop bookmaker.
So take us through IG Index. What were you there to do? And looking back, how did you go at it?
Well, I got into it simply because I was desperate for money at university. I was working in a clothing shop, for big men, amusingly for people. I am a big man, and it paid terribly, minimum wage. And I had a friend who said to me, how would you like to basically watch sport and, get paid much better for it? And it's evenings and weekend work, but it's not too many hours. And again, people laugh. The watching sport, I wasn't actually that bothered by either or, but they would pay for your takeaway, your food takeaway in the evening, which was hugely appealing to me. So I said, yeah, I'll interview for that. Went fine, got the job. So I was just working on the phones, taking bets. This is going to be around 2002, I think. Back then, it's sort of online. I want to say online was definitely coming. Definitely took plenty of bets over the phone though. And so my very first real introduction into betting was spread betting. So I sort of entered into a level which was already, I suppose, treating betting and odds compilation as a much more intellectual activity maybe than other people were at the time. And I was introduced to this incredible array of characters and personalities, brains and unorthodox brains. At school and university, you meet a lot of very academic people, but you don't necessarily meet a lot of people who are thinking in a very different way. There's nothing sort of pre-programmed about it. And I kind of loved that. There were a lot of individuals. And so I started working on the phones, and I thought this is quite fun, actually. And I got to the end of my university degree, had no idea what I wanted to do. And then I thought, well, do you know what? They pay quite well, and I got quite into this. And I've started to see, how the numbers are put together, and I'm thinking, I kind of see some, pleasing ordering of statistics type things I like to do. And I thought, yeah, no, this maybe is something I can give a go. And I remember asking the then head of IG Index, who's a fabulous man called Paul Austin, just a really wonderful human being, whether he would possibly consider me to be trained as an odds compiler. And he said yes immediately. He was very, very considerate about it. He said, he even told me that he said that he'd had a similar thing when I was his age, where he'd gone in and asked for a job. He'd worked largely in PR most of his life, but he was an absolute lover of sport, lover of betting. So I got my first job as a junior odds compiler pretty much out of university.
How did you go about player profiling, as we'd call it now, with large spreads where you can have probably anomaly results or outliers quite often, where it's a large change in your bankroll probably? How did you think about the players, and I guess who was sharp, who was not?
If I'm being brutally honest with you, Jake, the spread betting, and I think from what I've spoken to people at Sporting Index who worked at the same time, you were generally taught to believe that you were the best, and that you knew better than anyone. And there wasn't the attitude maybe to profiling that there is now, certainly. There were occasional individuals who were markers who we would treat the business, wouldn't necessarily allow them to have the full size bet they asked for, but they'd still get a reasonable stake on, and we'd move the markets on their prices. But a lot of those weren't the traditional city types. It's strange because you can be a superb lawyer, accountant, broker, trader, but when you're having a bet, suddenly all those skills that you've employed in that profession don't necessarily translate to when you're, emotion is in play, and you're having a bet on something that you're not used to necessarily being an expert on. So
we're all fallible.
Yeah. But yeah, so the profiling was different then. There were people who played in a strange way. Arbitrage and spread betting is easier to see than it is in fixed odds, in that if there's a gap between the two spreads, there's an arb. There were people who would play those, and again, even those were treated with a bit more sympathy is not the right word, but a bit more sort of grudging respect, in the sense that they would alert you, again, pre-strong internet days, and there's never been a good odds comparison website for spread betting firms. We had to trawl our rivals' websites to make sure, and of course these guys would be trawling it all the time, the arbors, and they'd find it for you, and often they'd get £5 a point, £10 a point here or there to sort of help you tighten up the market. But yes, I would say that some of the really big bettors, the ones who had maybe big city backgrounds, huge bonuses each year, that kind of thing, we'd almost look forward to those with glee to a degree, in that sometimes being exceptional in your own field gives you too much confidence when you dip into something else. So some of the biggest stakers also would end up being some of our biggest losers. Yeah, we were taught first and foremost to come up with a good price, and to be happy to stand by our price if we thought we'd come up with it correctly. And there was a traders, we all knew, or everyone knew who was a trader at which rival spread betting firm, and so they'd call up, and you'd then go on their website, maybe you'd see, oh, they haven't put odds up yet, but the trader from their firm is on, so we're going to get basically a little look basically on their direction early on. And sometimes God, it would depend on day to day. Sometimes these people would get short shrift, and sometimes we'd be happy to, take it. There's a lot of code of gentlemen, or maybe it should be honor amongst thieves. I don't know which one, but they very much treated it. There were certain people who, in their minds, they didn't take the piss. They would call up and they'd ask for £10 a point, and it was considered a steer by them, and you'd be like, okay, that's fine. And there'd be other people who you knew were trying to get a huge bet on, or alternatively were getting their friends, wives, girlfriends, whatever it may be, to try and get a bet on. And it was a sort of a sense of that's not playing it fair. And so as a result, you're not going to get anything. I would say that if you can, I don't know, in a fixed odds bookmaker, you hear different numbers bandied around. I'd hear 2% of bookmakers' clients are winners, or whatever it may be. I'd say in spread betting, it was smaller still, because the average Joe struggles to really understand it. Yeah, more generous, I think, in a lot of ways than it is now. That's for sure.
Yeah. So you touched on it a little bit, but how do you, throughout a cricket match or a golf tournament or a golf round, how do you evaluate what's happening? You mentioned you might have someone from a fixed odds bookmaker place a bet, or you might have the city banker who's going to lose, place a large bet. You've probably got the arbors in there as well, and you've got a whole bunch of other people and other information coming in. How are you treating all that information, and does it differ between you and some of the other guys you mentioned earlier? Is everyone have their own style and approach ultimately, or are you pretty much sticking to certain foundations?
I think everyone adopted to a degree their own style and approach. We were told that the company had deep pockets. We could. This changed after I left, I have to say, but certainly back when I was doing it, the attitude was we were happy to take a swing. It doesn't matter if you lost a lot of money on one match, provided you lost it doing the right types of thing. So when accumulating all that knowledge that comes in, for me personally, I always wanted to move my odds around on the cheap marks, but also I would move them a little bit off the big size bets. I wasn't hugely stubborn, and quite often, especially when you're junior, you're doing less liquid, let's call it less liquid sporting events. You may not take a huge amount of bets, and there was this desire to sort of smooth your P&L a little bit out on it. But some of the other guys there would happily take, £500 a point, £1,000 a point on things. Runs could easily be, several £1,000s long or short of the total runs in a cricket match. And those guys would happily just take it. We knew that we didn't have a huge amount of customers, and we knew that even fewer than the amount of customers we had were the ones that would bet big and lose big. So in a way, you had to make sure that you got that business. It was difficult to knock it back or even ask if they could bet in a smaller size. So you had to, again, it came back to making sure that you had a good price. And, we were always comparing, and IG had a bizarre scenario whereby we were always comparing ourselves to Sporting Index, who were definitely the largest and still the largest, what's left of them, sports spread betting firm. And spread betting thrived on, in the same way as fixed odds betting, it thrived on people wanting to bet, wish fulfillment, betting on what they want to see happen. So they bet on action, they buy goals, they buy runs. It's always on the buy side. They want to see things happen, and because Sporting Index had the lion's share of the recreational punters, they could always afford to be one or two ticks higher than us. At least that was always our perception. I mean, it may not always have been true, but in our minds, they often were higher, and they could afford to be higher, and it was right for them to be higher because they would extract more money out of their client base. We, on the other hand, if we'd gone up with the same prices as them, would have got, we might have got some buyers. We also, had to entertain quite a few people who were not necessarily long-term winners, but you had to work to get the money out of them. And so we don't want to give them cheap, easy sell opportunities. So we would often be a little bit lower than them. And so you constantly have that frame. Whenever you traded anything, we had the other spread betting firms' websites up. You had to know where you stood in terms of the market for us. And then on top of that, we generally would, most people felt like they had to lay a decent sized bet, especially to the people that we knew were, recreational. And then, I don't know, if you took a phone bet, this is pretty sort of major internet. If you took a phone bet from someone who was known to be particularly sharp or an arbor, it kind of sometimes would depend day to day, mood to mood. Sometimes they'd tell them they can have nothing and we'd move the price. And other times people would get, a bigger bet on and we'd use the information happily. I think the strange thing is that we had profiling notes on the accounts, and yet there were certain accounts where everyone had their own opinion in their own head about how they really should be treated. So, but when the internet was more, when we were taking more bets over the internet, everyone had a ticker up and could see the bets come through and could react as they saw fit, really. So I would say we were given there's far less risk structure. In fact, we didn't even have risk managers, as they call them, or separate risk people until sort of towards the end of my time at IG, in fact. So the traders were in charge of calling the shots with how they wanted to shape their book and who they let bet and what size they bet in.
Let's talk price. Unlike bookies and toads, the Betfair exchange is a low-margin, buy-sell fixed odds marketplace where the value stays with the punter, not the house. Ready for the game within the game? Join betfair.com.au. Gamble responsibly.
With that in mind, then, take us back to the pricing of a match or an event.
Mm-hmm.
Were you outsourcing any of that? Were you just looking at the market? And I know now it's probably largely consolidated, and there's certainly a different approach from certainly fixed odds bookmakers and being sort of around sort of the market price. What was it like back then, and did it change at all?
In terms of outsourcing, we did not sell our because IG Index in the end had a fixed odds website called ExtraBet, and in between that we actually had another website called Binary Bet, and Binary Bet was spread betting where the only two outcomes were 0 or 100. So it was like Betfair in effect. You could buy or sell, and it was the equivalent of backing or laying. And then we had ExtraBet, which was a website, fixed odds website, whereas the first website, to my knowledge, I'm almost certain, because spread betting lends it to, which we had cash out. And what I find amusing is that we had a launch party for ExtraBet 2004 or 5, something like that. And they showed a demo of cashing out, and people laughed and called it absolute shit. So there you go. Turns out you can just find things at the wrong time. But yes, so we had all this information being churned out by the models for fixed odds. And in reality, looking back, we almost certainly should have outsourced it and sold it. Sporting Index did. Sporting Solutions now is a huge part of their product, where they sell out live odds and odds, but we didn't. But what we did do was we market made into Betfair and into BetDAC back then. And that really did change. That was a huge dimension to the business, because then your traders market making, they're generating liquidity for the exchange, but they're taking positions on the exchange fixed odds, they're taking positions on the spread bets, and they're effectively on the exchange, they're proprietary trading really, to a degree, and then on the spread bets, they're trying to, maximize some recreational business there. On the exchange, they weren't necessarily up against recreational type bettors, although back then Betfair arguably did have more recreational type punters. So in terms of outsourcing information, there was a period where the market would probably be getting good information out of IG's models and expertise and experience by looking at Betfair. Particularly, there were some sports that we provided liquidity for, like rugby, which, you go on Betfair now and it can be absolutely dry. There's no money on there at all. And so that information could have quite easily have been filtered into the marketplace. But we never went around down the selling odds to other people route like Sporting Index did. Sorry, I feel like I've skipped away.
No, I'm just interested in pricing and how you get to your obviously putting out a market and in the spread betting world or landscape, and I guess how you compiled all the different elements that go into it. Hugely
stats and mathematical model driven, basically. Most of the original sports spread betting models were built by sort of a handful of people. And again, a lot of it just comes from, white papers, the kind of stuff academic papers you find online, Dixon Coles, the sort of classical early football model. Okay, so we've got an idea there for sort of, early expected goals. How do we create, goal inputs? I don't know if it was as bad as this when I started, but it could have just been guys averaging how many goals were scored and how many goals were conceded the last 10 games or whatever. But you got those inputs in, and then you plug them into the models that have been designed for us. Initially, they would be just spreadsheets that would produce all the derivatives. You put in always your model drivers. So in the example of soccer, for the international audience, it would be your supremacy and your total goals. Supremacy, something that we were familiar with from spread betting, and the Asian market was familiar from Asian handicaps. But supremacy, not necessarily a phrase that actually sort of, people who came from a fixed odds betting background in spread betting sort of wouldn't necessarily have heard that term or that phrase. But then you derive from your total goals and your supremacy goal expectancies for the home team and for the away team, plug them into the model, which you've probably got off the internet and then refined using your own maths guys or your own, didn't call them quants, it was generally the guy who was good on Excel or whoever it was. And then that would spit out all the derivatives. And then you'd ask yourself, how can we then move this model in running? Because, if you did something quite good, if you did quite a good ELO model, say for soccer, which a lot of them were originally, it's hard to translate easily into inputs. And then those inputs are what you really need to drive a live model. In the end, you just start by just coming up with the inputs first, so the goal expectancies, and then plug them into the model, and that would, do the rest. Even back then, and I think possibly this was happening more maybe at Sporting Index than it was in IG, but there definitely was creeping in the knowledge that we could take odds from Asia, derive the supremacy and the total goals from that, and then put those straight into the models. And you've already got a little hint of where the industry's heading. You're not paying someone so much to come up with that. But most of the traders I knew back then, they wanted to come up with their own numbers. And, and they did. They would look at Betfair, they'd look at Asia. But they were being paid really well back then. The salaries in spread betting were really good. And they wanted to prove their worth, if you like, come up with their own numbers. But yeah, there was always emotion and feel were generally frowned upon in spread betting, and the way that we had taken odds compiling so statistically was a badge of honor in spread. That we did things differently to the fixed odds firms, and we crunched the numbers and we built databases, which weren't, now the data is every time on the internet, every day on the internet, I'm blown away by some new repository of data that I can't believe someone's giving away for free, when I was sat there having to plug numbers into spreadsheets, like when the goal minutes, when goals were scored and corners and all this kind of stuff. And now there's someone out there who just can, spit it all out, for free.
Yeah, it's very different. So how do you see it changing or evolving as, I guess, consolidation happens of pricing? Do you think that makes the market potentially more beatable, in that you may only have a handful of businesses or people or models out there producing mass prices for the industry?
I vacillate day to day in that my mind initially says that the less amount of market makers, so independent thinkers in a market, the weaker the market will be. And therefore, this homogenized pricing, where there's only a handful of people with trading rooms and coming up with prices, is going to be very detrimental to the quality of pricing. And then other days, I think to myself, do you know what? As long as everyone is just trading the liabilities sensibly enough, we'll get to a decent price anyway. Now, that's a big if. Let's say everyone had to take the same price. Everyone had to take the same tissue from one central odds compilation depository. let's call that depository Bet365. So everyone takes their odds from one location and puts up their odds. Now that set of odds is only going to be as good as the odds compiler who originally came up with that original line. And then what you need is for each one of those groups of people to trade their client base, who they've acquired through whichever promotional or marketing strategy, is to trade their liabilities. And one of the problems I think we have in terms of pricing quality is people don't really trade the liabilities, or if they do, they don't necessarily trade them correctly. So we don't get the price differentiation that should occur. You should have 10 people, even if they all took the same odds, taking different bets, moving their odds in accordance. ARBs open, ARBs close, ARBs open, ARBs closed. Maybe it's Slovakian soccer and some bookmaker in Slovakia has got some very sharp clients on it. They move dramatically one direction. That then influences the rest of the market and that information filters through. But no one ever wants to have an ARB ever. No one wants markets to behave how they're supposed to behave. And everyone wants the perfect price and they want no arbitrage getting to the perfect price. And so you get these people who are basically copying a small amount of bookmakers who may or may not be trading their liabilities. And even if they are trading their liabilities, you've not taken a bet. You're following someone else who's taken a bet and moved their odds. So for me, it shouldn't matter really who comes up with the odds or how many people come up with the odds, providing everyone trades it correctly. However, I do think there is a problem if you've got lots of people, because consolidation is such now that there are some phenomenal companies who will provide you a bookmaker out of a box, right from payment processing to odds fees to live trading to risk management to you name it. And my hope is that these companies and the bookmakers who use them will recognize the importance of trading their exposures correctly, trading their liabilities correctly, and moving their odds around. And you've got to get a little bit of the Pinnacle in you, in a way, in that if you take a big bet, ask yourself, is it wise just to not move the odds at all? Or if you take a bet from someone that you think is sharp, well, at least move. I'm not saying that everyone should be Pinnacle and they can't be Pinnacle, but the idea that everyone takes this one feed and the only time that feed moves is when the Bet365 of this world takes a bet and decide to move their odds. Right now there's sort of a recreational bookmaker average feed, and it gets moved up and down basically by the movements in Betfair, Pinnacle, and maybe the Asian market, where the sort of perceived sharp sources will nudge it around. But I'd like to, and people sort of say, but people seem to sort of have mixed feelings about liability trading. But for me, it's simple in that I think a lot of people think liability trading means two players playing in a tennis match, take a bet on A, make them shorter in order to try and get a bet on B to level your book. People seem to think that bookmaking is, an exercise in trying to create green books. It's absolutely not. It's a terrible way to run a bookmaker. You never really want balanced books in truth, because if you've done your job correctly to acquire recreational customers, the herd mentality in betting means that they'll consistently bet on the same outcome as their fellow recreational bettors. So what you want to do is take a bet on player A, make it a bit shorter. Next customer has a bet on player A. You've booked it at a better price. You move it again. Player 3 comes in, bets it. You booked it even better price. You basically get phenomenal averaging in at a great price level for something which you make the true price further away from. And you can only, if you think that after any given bet placed on a market, it's more likely that the next bet you take is going to be on that same side of that market, you've got to do the math. You've got to realize that, well, okay, I need to make people pay up over and over again. A lot of people don't have recreational punters, or they try and do this model, but they do it on very low level sporting events where they're going to take only one bet maybe or something like that. Those, absolutely not. But just the general principle that, everyone should try, the guy, let's say you're trading French football, the French bookmakers should be doing, if they're taking loads of money on Paris Saint-Germain, the favorite, they're getting beaten. Well, we're in a world whereby they don't ever want to move those odds because it creates arbitrage opportunity. But if they've built their bookmaker correctly and their proportions are right, so they've maybe got 2% sharp punters and 98% recreational French punters, and those 98% are all betting Paris Saint-Germain, they're all allowed the same bet limits. The smart guys are allowed, similar bet limits. Profiling is a difficult subject. Then yes, you make more out of correctly trading the recreational side of the book. But we've got so many bookmakers. There's only so much recreational money to go around. I do get why that's difficult. But for me, I got no problem with everyone taking one price in one place. We just got to get clever about how we trade the money when we do take it. That would be my thoughts.
So you mentioned Pinnacle, and they obviously probably enjoy arbitrage because they're more than likely on the right or better side of the arb generally. Tell us why, from your perspective, there can't be more Pinnacles out there.
Well, interesting. Marco Bloom touched on this. Is that there's a huge barrier to entry in terms of how you get that business off the ground originally. What I find interesting is that people forget just how much American money Pinnacle had, how many American customers, and I think people assume that Pinnacle is incredibly, essentially only has sharp punters or people who know what they're doing at least. And I believe that Pinnacle at one point, will have had genuine, just good recreational business, and what did Ted say? They lost 70% of their business overnight when they turned off the States, and so that must have meant a slight change in business model, I'm guessing. Although some of those American players obviously would have been very sharp players, I'm sure as well. So that you get this model whereby they basically work by being an enormous betting syndicate that is basically arbitraging against the soft bookmakers of the world, and they're utilizing decent own models and the markers within their own system who they profiled correctly, and they've got very keen overrounds already. So you've got a company who is in place already taking a lot of the arbitrage business that's available. They've heavily affiliated themselves with the arbitrage alert software. In fact, they can probably afford to rebate, properly affiliate style deals with arbitrage software because their arbors are, they're losing clients. This is the tragic thing is if you're Pinnacle, every day you don't close any clients, and yet every day thousands of your clients are being effectively closed because they get closed by retail bookmakers. But fortunately, there's plenty of people who want to, do the work from home, make easy money, arbitrage things. So they've got new meat in the mill. So if you're a new bookmaker who thinks, right, I'm going to take this on, you've got to have an overround that's small enough that you can generate the similar style arbitrages, and then you're going to be better at spotting the arbitrage opportunities than Pinnacle already are. And if you want to be better than them and make sure that you actually make room for the arbitrage to even appear, you potentially have to not only be better than them, but then you also have to have an overround that's tighter than theirs. And then you need to get clients, Pinnacle will happily say, I'm sure, that, yes, they obviously put work into their models, but a huge amount of, what they make money is the proprietary information from the clients who bet with them. So you've got to get smart clients in and have a reduced overround and make sure that the smart clients you're in are smarter than the smart clients at Pinnacle. Not to mention there's going to be some guys out there who are going to, I'm sure, double dip, they'll hit Pinnacle first, then you, and maybe they can do it fast. You have to have a huge technological arms race available. You have to be able to make sure your prices are moving perfectly, and all the movements are sort of super slick, and the profiling is perfect. You just need to do a huge amount to compete in that particular space. And all the while, you've got to assume that if you're doing something to this level of professionalism, this kind of quality, and putting this much thought into it, why the hell are you doing it to make comparatively little money? Pinnacle is a very profitable company, but they're not Bet365. Building a phenomenal retail recreational bookmaker is more profitable if you can do it, really well. Pinnacle's got low variance, I picture, in their profitability. They're pretty consistent in the same way that any arbor, if you've worked in a retail bookmaker and you've looked at an arbor's account and it seems like they never bloody lose, well, guess what? They are losing. They're losing at Pinnacle, and they're doing it pretty as consistently there as they're winning off you there. So it's great cash business. Lots of money being made, but even bigger money is to be made by being a great recreational bookmaker of the top level. Or alternatively, if you've got people together who've got the intelligence and brilliance to put together something that beats Pinnacle consistently, why aren't they in a hedge fund?
Yeah, right.
Why aren't they employing these things elsewhere? Pinnacle just caught lightning in a bottle. Brilliantly intelligent people, maybe didn't want to work in finance, maybe just didn't want to be conventional, maybe wanted to do things their own way, and they leveraged this intelligence to create a system that just worked so well. And their own success makes it hard to break in. I don't want to say it's impossible, but I have to think that the kind of person that wants to do it has to absolutely love and embrace the intellectual challenge that they face. I read a recent article about the guys. There were two guys, American guys, weren't there, who did massive Hong Kong pools. I read a brilliant long interview with the guy.
Yeah, Bill Benter.
That's the one, yeah. And you look at that guy, he could have made more money. Absolutely more money on Wall Street. No doubt about it. He's just an exceptional, brilliant individual. But he liked horse racing. He liked that particular game, And it's if you know that you can beat a variety of games, or you think you can, you just picked the one he wanted to beat the most, and the one he was interested in. And so you kind of need to, Pinnacle 2.0 or whoever it may be, has to be someone with huge intellectual curiosity, brilliance, and deep pockets to get it off the ground. One thing I will say is that Pinnacle, Magnus Hedman, who owns a good portion of them, he owns a good portion of Sporting Solutions, and he owns TouchBet outright. It's three big betting companies. That's a lot of balls to juggle, and Pinnacle just announced B2B. They never ever would have touched B2B once upon a time. It was all about getting individual clients to the door. We're talking about selling Pinnacle's own profiling to the world and to that. So I would say that I would definitely be looking to see. They may not drop their standards at all. They may go from strength to strength, be as brilliant as they've always been. But there's definitely an opportunity right now. There's different people. In the moment someone sold out that huge share to Magnus, someone kind of cashed a good portion of their chips, is the way I see it. And I don't know. Sometimes these companies are so hinged to the ethos and mentality of the original early investors, the people. Look at Andrew Black with Betfair, and the slight changes that happened to when those core people of Betfair moved on. I'm fascinated I will be watching like a hawk for where the Pinnacle model goes. It's interesting. I listened to a podcast just the other day. Someone said Pinnacle limits are much lower, and it's true. Compare Pinnacle limits on things, 10, 15 years ago. They were higher. And the way I see it is business has gotten tougher for them. I don't know if they envisaged quite how ruthless profiling would go in the the clients who their arbors are, who they're their agents placing their bets for them basically in the arbors, having a harder and harder time of it. You used to hear about arbors who are making, 6 figures a year, 10 years ago. To earn 6 figures as an arbor now, it's just incredible. It's an incredible exercise in basically opening up accounts in other people's names effectively. So I'm very interested to know, like, you see the drop in those limits. they can't afford to pay people the same amount for salaries have dropped at Pinnacle HQ. Now, if you're someone providing information to Pinnacle or getting bets on for them effectively, they're willing to pay you less per movement. Before they'd give you $2,000 at something and then they'd move it, a couple of ticks. And now they're willing for the same amount of information to pay you $500 for it. So yeah, I'm very interested. So in terms of could someone step in and do Pinnacle to more Pinnacle-ish standards, I can't rule it out. But I definitely, if someone came to me with it as a business proposal, you could not be high on my list of things I'd spend money on.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I want to ask, what excites you about the betting industry, betting markets as they are today? Are you looking at exchanges or fixed odds betting or parimutuel spread betting, whatever it might be? What are some of the areas on the betting or bookmaking side that get you excited?
Constant eyes on the evolution of pool bets. I mean, Colossus bets is a big thing in terms of proper product development that's happened. I say product development. Parimutuel's old as the hills, but the syndicate betting options they're offering. The British horse racing is a bit of a mess, so I don't know how. The Tote has done, Betfred's side of the Tote has done a deal with the Hong Kong Jockey Club to merge pools or something, and then Colossus has got some access to it, but another company's like, I feel like Australians have had essentially a pretty, whatever you say about the tab, I mean, they kind of done parimutuel pretty well, right? I mean, I feel like they kind of run, decent sized pools well, kind of thing. And I feel like the pool system has, Betfred took over the Tote, and it's funny because Bernard I probably butchered his name, Matronelli of Clossbets actually was quite lenient on Fred Doan, who had Betfred, about how he feels he dealt with the pools, and he sort of said words like sort of slightly mismanaged or maybe not the right route. Other people I'd speak to would say it's the worst thing that's ever happened to anything in betting ever. But I'm excited to see if those things can be sorted out, if horse racing pool betting can be done better in the UK, where, as I say, smart people can get on without any problems. And, if that pool betting can be transferred to more sports, that's interesting. I watch with interest as to how, cryptocurrency is going to affect. Are we going to see more and more cryptocurrency bookmakers keep on growing and growing? They create an interesting dynamic in terms of, obviously your bankroll changes daily on the fluctuation of the currency. It's harder to profile people, or rather it's harder to keep people accounts closed on crypto. If crypto really stabilized, if it became less volatile, there'd be plenty of serious bettors, I think, who'd really start to make the contemplate about doing more of that, because it's a bit of an easier ride in terms of, you can open a betting account with, just an email address in crypto. So it makes it easier for the pros to reopen. In a way, if you're deliberately closing crypto accounts over and over again, you're sort of really up against it. You start having to try and track all sorts of things that, we can debate about how nice it is to track, IPs and device IDs and all these kind of things. And I think that if crypto stabilizes, maybe Pinnacle 2.0, because the processing fees aren't there, reducing fees and keeping a super lean business, if you want to create the second Pinnacle, is key. So, could the second Pinnacle be a cryptocurrency bookmaker? That's something that interests me. I think with the increased betting opportunities in America that are coming, I think it's going to be slower than people think, but I think there should be a pretty, courtesy of the DFS industry, there should be a pretty huge explosion in prop betting, I'd imagine, on player-based props. The American market loves to analyze stats of individual players. All their sports pretty much lend themselves to the analysis of individual player performance. So with that explosion in prop betting, traditionally prop betting has been something that all pro punters or serious punters want to be doing. they all think they've got a phenomenal, or probably most of them do have a phenomenal edge on it, but you've got very small limits. They maybe limit themselves to only doing it at the Super Bowl, that kind of thing. More and more people doing it. Pricing will get a bit keener. Maybe limits will get a bit higher. The people who are just making easy money off it will disappear as the edges disappear a little bit. But maybe then, the thing is about player props is people think, like, oh, I can only get, $200 down or $500 down on it. Well, how many, an MLB slate each evening, how many different players can you play? You play every single player prop in every single game for every player. That $200 or whatever multiplies out really fast. And what's interesting is there's these DFS people who've taken like individual player analytics to, sabermetrics baseball style is extended everywhere. So you've got these guys who are probably absolutely desperate to have some decent player props and player props in running, not just pre-match. And then there's going to be bookmakers employing DFS guys. So, there's going to be a little bit of poacher turn gamekeeper stuff going on. And potentially then I'd love to see that player props market and live player props market really explode. I think that'd be, a very interesting area to go, because the American betting market is pretty stale. It's pretty singles and parlays and pretty much all pre-match stuff, sides and totals. So I'm hoping for a revolution in British horse racing pool betting. I'm hoping to have a clearer view on cryptocurrency bookmakers, and I'm hoping for an opportunity to bet on, how fast someone runs between two bases, under and over, in a couple of $100 a pop.
No, it's a fascinating list. Some of the topics keep coming up, so I think there's a few with a keen eye. Matthew, I appreciate your time, from Magic the Gathering all the way through to the US market opening up. Been a fun chat, and I certainly do appreciate it.
Thank you very much.